I never thought a single night could rewrite everything I believed about family, loyalty, and the idea that time eventually heals old wounds. I walked into my father's 70th birthday celebration believing I was finally strong enough to handle whatever happened. I told myself I would smile, clap, and pretend everything was normal. I practiced deep breathing in the car before walking inside because I honestly thought the worst that could happen was a few awkward glances or distant hugs. But I wasn't prepared for what actually took place, and I certainly never expected my 8-year-old son to become the voice that shattered years of silence. If you had walked into that ballroom with me, you would have seen everything that makes a celebration look perfect. Soft jazz music played from a live band, the chandeliers glowed with warm gold lighting, and every table was decorated with navy blue runners, white roses, and small glass candles. There were framed photographs of my father placed on easels around the room. Pictures of him as a young man in the military, smiling at his retirement ceremony, fishing with my brother, holding my sister's newborn twins. I looked around for just one photograph of me, something that proved I had once mattered too, but there wasn't a single one, not even a childhood picture, not one wedding picture, not one family holiday shot, nothing. And yet, I still took a slow breath and thought, maybe he didn't choose the photos. Maybe someone else handled it. You would be surprised at how far the mind will go to protect a heart that has been bruised too many times. I looked down at my son, Caleb, who was holding my hand tightly as we walked through the door. He was dressed in khaki pants, a white button-down shirt, and the same little brown belt he wears on school picture day. Caleb has always been the kind of child who notices what other people overlook, especially when it comes to feelings. He scanned the room with his big, thoughtful eyes, then looked up at me and whispered, "Mom, why aren't there any pictures of you?" His voice wasn't accusatory, only confused and protective. I swallowed hard, squeezed his hand gently, and whispered back, "It's okay. We're here to celebrate Grandpa." He didn't argue, but he didn't stop thinking about it either. Caleb rarely lets go of things that don't make sense. When we approached the table reserved for the immediate family, my father's wife Vivian was already seated. She was dressed in a fitted emerald green dress, pearl earrings, and a perfectly styled short haircut that matched her personality, sharp, controlled, polished, and always watching. She gave my siblings warm, enthusiastic hugs, complimenting their clothes and their children, before glancing at me with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Madeline," she said, as if reading from a script someone forced her to recite. Then she leaned forward and looked at Caleb with a more pleasant expression. "Well, aren't you a handsome young man?" Caleb smiled politely, but his hand stayed locked in mine. We sat down, and as people continued arriving, I silently rehearsed how I would react during the speeches. I promised myself I would not cry. I would not excuse myself to the restroom. I would not let my son see me crumble. I wanted him to be proud that I showed up even when it hurt. Then the event host tapped the microphone and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered tonight to honor a man who has impacted countless lives as a father, mentor, leader, and friend, Mr. Richard Carter." The entire room erupted in applause. I clapped too, even though my stomach felt tight. My father walked to the front of the ballroom with a proud smile, shoulders squared, looking every bit like the respected patriarch everyone saw him as. He cleared his throat and said, "Thank you all for coming. I want to take a moment to speak about my children, the people who make life meaningful." That sentence should have brought warmth to my heart. Instead, it triggered the beginning of something I will never be able to forget, because by the time he finished speaking, I realized he didn't consider me one of them. And when the cake was finally brought out, my quiet, observant, gentle son climbed onto a chair in front of everyone and asked a question that no one in that room was ready to hear. Before I continue, I need to explain how I even ended up at that party after years of emotional distance. My relationship with my father didn't fall apart all at once. It faded slowly, like a photograph left in the sun too long. I was the oldest child, the one who helped with school projects, cooked dinner when my mom worked late, and learned how to braid my sister's hair. When my mom got sick, I was the one who stayed up through long nights, learned how to measure medication, and memorized what each beep on the home health monitor meant. My father once told me I was the glue, and I believed him. I built my identity around being reliable, useful, needed. Then, after my mother passed, he remarried, and the glue that held our family together started drying out around me instead of through me. Life changed faster than I could process. My father met Vivian through friends at a charity banquet. She was charming, confident, socially influential, and spoke as if life was a competition and she intended to win. In the beginning, I tried to welcome her because my mother raised me to respect people who entered our lives, even if they were temporary. But Vivian didn't want a family. She wanted an audience. She made subtle comments, the kind that sound harmless to anyone who wasn't the target. Things like, "Some people prefer emotional hobbies instead of successful careers," when referring to my job helping struggling readers. Or, "Real leaders don't get stuck raising children alone," after my divorce. She never needed to raise her voice. Humiliation was her art form. Over time, I realized my father changed in her shadow. He became someone who measured worth by outward success and recognition. My sister Lauren was praised because she had given the family true legacy by having twins. My brother Evan was honored because he multiplied wealth and status. I was gently pushed into the category of nice but underwhelming, a private verdict that eventually became public. Despite all of that, a part of me still believed there was something left worth saving. The truth is, I am a single mother, and when you raise a child alone, you want them to know where they belong. I didn't want Caleb growing up thinking family is something you run from. I wanted him to see that showing up is not weakness, it's courage. I wanted him to know that you can honor someone even when they don't know how to honor you back. My everyday life is modest, peaceful, and real. I work as a reading intervention tutor at a local elementary school, helping kids who struggle with comprehension, speech rhythm, or confidence. I earn enough to pay bills, keep Caleb fed, and occasionally treat him to pancake sundaes at the diner down the street. Our apartment is small but warm, decorated with hand-drawn pictures, school awards, and small notes like "Love you, Mom" that Caleb sticks to the fridge with mismatched magnets. Caleb is not a loud child, but he is deeply observant and emotionally intelligent. He notices tone more than volume, silence more than noise. When I wipe my eyes in the kitchen, he doesn't ask if I'm crying. He asks, "Is it something you need to talk about, or do you want quiet time?" You can't teach that. That is spirit-given empathy. When the birthday invitation came, printed on thick cardstock with gold embossed lettering, Caleb saw it before I did. He picked it up, studied it with curiosity, and said, "Grandpa wants us to go?" I smiled without answering right away. He spoke again, gently pressing, "If it makes you sad, we don't have to. We can send a card." But I didn't want him thinking avoiding difficult rooms was the same as protecting yourself. I smiled and said, "We're going. Families don't have to be perfect to show up." He nodded, not fully understanding, but trusting me anyway. We picked out his clothes together because he wanted to look grown up, and I wore a simple navy dress I had owned for years. I didn't go to impress anyone. I went to represent myself. On the drive to the event, Caleb sat quietly holding a small notebook he liked to draw in. Halfway there, he looked out the window and said, "Mom, does Grandpa love you the same as Aunt Lauren and Uncle Evan?" His voice was careful, almost apologetic. I didn't lie, but I didn't wound him either. I said, "Love doesn't always look the same, buddy, but we can still show ours." He thought for a moment, then said, "I think real love should feel safe." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. That sentence replayed in my mind the entire night, and it became the very foundation of what happened next. From the moment we sat down, I could feel a quiet but growing pressure inside my chest, like the air in the room was heavier for me than anyone else. Conversations were light, cheerful, and celebratory, but every time someone made eye contact with me, there was a quick shift, either pity, uncertainty, or discomfort. People didn't know whether to acknowledge me warmly or keep their distance, so most settled for polite smiles and short nods. I wasn't angry at them. I understood. It's awkward to greet someone who looks like family but is treated like a ghost. Dinner was served family style, with servers placing dishes in the center of the table. My siblings sat across from me, Evan in a gray tailored suit, scrolling through congratulatory texts from clients, and Lauren wearing a soft peach dress, gently rocking one of her twins in her arms. She looked at me twice with a sympathetic half smile, but not long enough to invite conversation. She always feared conflict more than she valued honesty. Meanwhile, Vivian was glowing with pride as she whispered to guests about how carefully she planned the evening. She spoke like a queen reigning at a gala. We wanted a celebration that reflects the class and excellence Richard has always embodied. When a woman from their church complimented the decor, Vivian smiled and said, "I believe a man's legacy should only highlight what uplifts the family name." She didn't look at me when she said it, but she didn't have to. Caleb sat quietly, looking around the room while gently swinging his feet under the chair. I knew he sensed something wasn't right. He leaned toward me and whispered, "Mom, everyone looks happy except you." I answered softly, "I'm okay, honey. Sometimes grown-ups carry feelings they don't show." He nodded, but his eyes drifted to my father with a look that made me nervous. Not angry or hostile, but deeply curious. Soon the event host announced that the moment had arrived for speeches. Applause rose again as my father stood, buttoned his navy blazer, and walked toward the microphone. Everyone raised their phones, ready to record the touching tribute they assumed would unfold. I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, preparing myself like someone bracing for a cold wave. My father began warmly, thanking the guests and expressing gratefulness for a blessed and accomplished life. He then turned toward my siblings and began sharing personal stories. He spoke about how Evan became a man of resilience and enterprise, and how proud he was that his son had built a growing real estate empire from scratch. People clapped loudly, and Evan flashed his confident half-smile, raising his glass. Then my father spoke about Lauren, praising her for building a stable, nurturing home that represents true family legacy. He called her the heart that carries the Carter tradition forward. She teared up as people sighed in admiration. I sat, waiting, silently preparing for my turn, even if it would be short or awkward. I reminded myself that even the smallest acknowledgement, a memory, a sentence, would be enough to prove I was still somewhere in his heart. But he transitioned directly from talking about his children to thanking friends, mentors, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances, without mentioning my name at all. My breath caught in my throat like I had swallowed glass. I stared at him, expecting a correction, a sudden realization, a quick laugh followed by, and of course, my eldest, Madeline. But it never came. People shifted uncomfortably. A few glanced at me with wide eyes. Caleb's hand tightened around mine and he whispered, "Mom, he skipped you." There was no anger in his voice, only heartbreak. Then Vivian leaned slightly toward me, covering her smirk with a champagne glass, and whispered just loud enough, "Some children earn recognition, some don't. It's simply reality." Her tone wasn't emotional. It was factual, like she was explaining mathematical order. My body felt hot, but my face stayed still. Years of emotional training had prepared me for public humiliation. I simply stared at the tablecloth and repeated silently, "Don't cry. Not here, not in front of Caleb." Soon servers arrived with the cake, a 3-tier white and gold confection topped with 70 years loved, spelled out in edible pearls. Everyone stood to sing. I stood too, because dignity is not optional. But while everyone clapped, Caleb pulled his chair back and slowly climbed on top of it, placing one hand over his heart and the other on his small pocket where he kept his tablet. His voice, clear and calm, rose above the applause. "Grandpa," he said, "why didn't you talk about my mom? You cried at our house last month and said she was the only one who stayed when things were bad. Do you want me to play the video so everyone understands?" Gasps filled the room, instantly, and no one, including me, saw what was coming next. The room froze the instant Caleb spoke. It was as if every moving part of the celebration, the band, the whispers, the clinking glasses, suddenly stopped breathing. Even the candles flickered in a way that made the air feel charged. My father's expression, once confident and composed, shifted into confusion, then shock, and finally something that looked dangerously close to fear. Vivian's face tightened so suddenly that her practiced social smile cracked like thin ice. I placed my hand on Caleb's leg and whispered urgently, "Sweetheart, sit down. This isn't the time." But he didn't even glance at me. His eyes were fixed on his grandfather, calm and unwavering. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He was trying to correct an injustice his heart couldn't tolerate. Across the table, Lauren's eyes widened and she mouthed, Is he serious? While Evan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively, as if Caleb had publicly accused someone of a crime, and he didn't want to be implicated. The guests, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent, leaned closer instead. Human curiosity is powerful, especially when wrapped in scandal and the promise of truth. My father stepped forward, raising his palm in a half-gentle, half-warning gesture. "Caleb, buddy, come on down. Let's enjoy the cake and talk later, okay? Tonight is supposed to be a happy moment." Caleb blinked slowly and responded with the kind of honesty that only children are brave enough to use. "It's not happy if someone important gets erased." A ripple went through the room, not laughter, but the kind of murmur that happens right before people decide whose side they're on. Vivian sharply interjected, leaning her body toward the small crowd. "This is incredibly disrespectful. Children should not interrupt adults, especially during a formal celebration." She didn't even address Caleb directly. She performed her outrage for everyone else, like an actress who needed an audience to validate her authority. Caleb didn't flinch. He looked directly at her and asked, "Is it more disrespectful to speak the truth or to pretend someone doesn't matter?" Her mouth pressed into a tight line, and I could feel the room shifting again. Guests exchanged glances that said what none of them dared verbalize. This child is not misbehaving. He's telling the truth adults don't want to touch. At this point, I knew I had two choices. 1. Shut everything down to protect my father publicly and myself emotionally. 2. Allow the truth to surface even if it caused irreparable fractures. My heart was beating hard enough that my pulse echoed inside my ears. I stood up, gently holding Caleb's arms to help him down, and said softly, "Hey, look at me. I know why you're upset and your heart is right, but I don't want you to feel responsible for fixing grown-up problems." He shook his head and whispered, "But if nobody says it, it stays broken." At that moment, his words pierced straight through the adult logic I'd spent years using as armor. I realized he wasn't defending me as his mother. He was defending the version of love he believed families should practice. Children see injustice in its purest form. They don't need bitterness to recognize cruelty. When I looked up, every set of eyes was locked on us. Some were sympathetic, some horrified, others curious. The tension was so thick that the room seemed smaller. So I turned to my father and, for the first time in years, I spoke without cushioning my words. "Dad, he's not trying to hurt you. He's asking for something I stopped asking for a long time. Honesty and acknowledgement." My father swallowed hard and said quietly, "Maddie, I never meant to hurt you." Before I could respond, Vivian cut in with a defensive huff. "No one owes praise to someone who hasn't done anything noteworthy. This night is about legacy, not charity." That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not in rage, but in clarity. I took my phone out of my purse but didn't unlock it yet. My voice didn't shake when I spoke. "I don't want to embarrass anyone. I don't want revenge. But you don't get to rewrite history just because it's inconvenient to feel remorse." I turned back to my father and asked, "Do you want me to play the recording, or do you want to tell them what you said yourself?" This wasn't a threat. It was the first real invitation for truth we had shared in years, and for the first time that night, my father's facade cracked. My father stood motionless, staring at me as if the room had suddenly gone dark, and only we remained illuminated. His mouth opened slightly, but no words escaped. It was the first time in a long time that he didn't look like a retired principal, a disciplined leader, or a respected community figure. He looked like a man who finally realized he could no longer outrun the consequences of silence. Everyone was waiting, not politely but hungrily, for the next moment. Even the band members put down their instruments, and servers froze mid-step, holding dessert plates. The celebration had turned into a courtroom, and my father was the only one who could approach the stand. Vivian, however, refused to surrender control. She stepped forward, chin lifted, voice sharp enough to cut through glass. "Richard, you do not have to justify anything. Your life is yours to celebrate. We don't entertain emotional manipulation." Her statement wasn't aimed at my father. It was aimed at the audience, as if she were reminding them not to sympathize with anything they had heard or were about to hear. Caleb turned slowly to look at her and spoke with a calm, steady tone that seemed far too pure for such a heavy moment. Telling the truth isn't manipulation. Ignoring someone's feelings is. A few people gasped quietly. Others nodded so subtly it was almost invisible. Children have a way of collapsing arguments that adults build entire identities around. My father closed his eyes and exhaled shakily, then looked at me. Not around me, not through me, but directly at me for the first time in years. "Madeline," he began, voice strained, "I need to say this properly." Vivian's eyes widened, and she quickly grabbed his arm. "Richard, enough. This embarrassment is unnecessary. You have guests, reputation, and dignity to protect." My father gently removed her hand, not harshly, but decisively. A gesture that disrupted the power balance so sharply that the atmosphere shifted again. "I've spent too many years protecting my reputation," he said, voice cracking, "and very few protecting my daughter." Silence flooded the room. Few women in the crowd instinctively placed hands over their hearts. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." My father took a step closer to me, his voice trembling. "When your mother got sick, I wasn't strong the way everyone assumed. You were the strong one, even as a teenager. You held the house together. You stayed when it was difficult, and after she died, I didn't know how to be around you anymore." I blinked, trying to process every word. He continued, "You look like her. You talk like her. You care like her. Every time I saw you, I felt reminded of the years I failed your mother emotionally, and instead of facing that, I did something unforgivable. I withdrew from you and convinced myself that it was easier for both of us." My throat tightened, but no tears came yet. The pain was too old and too deeply rooted to fall as a single tear. It lived in my bones. He looked at the guests and admitted, "I erased her tonight because I didn't know how to honor her publicly without confronting my own guilt. That is not her failure. It's mine." For the first time, he didn't defend, rationalize, or minimize. He confessed, then he gently looked at Caleb. "And last month, when I came to your house and cried in your kitchen, I told you that you were the only one I hadn't apologized to. I begged you not to tell anyone because I was ashamed, not because I didn't mean it." Caleb nodded, whispering, "I know." My father placed his hand on the back of a chair to steady himself. "But tonight," he said, voice stronger, "my grandson reminded me that love without truth isn't love, it's performance." Vivian scoffed, shaking her head. "That is dramatic nonsense, Richard. Success and pride are what build legacy, not emotional indulgence." My father turned to her and spoke with a firm tone I hadn't heard since childhood discipline. "Legacy isn't built by pretending we only produce perfection. Legacy is built when the people we've hurt still stand close enough to give us another chance." Her face burned red with anger and humiliation. He looked at me again and said quietly, "I'm sorry I made you invisible so I didn't have to face myself." There it was, the truth that changed everything. And for the first time that night, I felt something I hadn't felt since my mother died. I felt seen. I stood there in front of my father, processing every word he had spoken. For years, I had wondered whether the distance between us was punishment, disappointment, or indifference. I never once imagined it was grief he didn't know how to survive. I expected anger, excuses, or more silence. Instead, the truth arrived trembling, raw, and unpolished, like a wound finally uncovered so it could breathe. The room remained silent, not because people were uncomfortable anymore, but because something sacred had happened. For the first time since my mother's funeral, honesty existed between us. No decorations, no speeches, no applause, just truth. Caleb slowly climbed down from the chair and walked toward my father, stopping only a foot away. My father knelt down, his knees trembling slightly from age and emotion. Caleb placed a small hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for telling the truth." It wasn't forgiveness or absolution. It was acknowledgement that something broken had shifted. My father cried again, this time publicly, without shame, without shielding himself behind a glass of champagne or polite laughter. That simple exchange between an 8-year-old and a 70-year-old man said more than any speech ever could. Vivian, however, refused to accept the emotional tone of the room. She scoffed loudly and announced, "This is ridiculous. I won't stand here and watch our respectable celebration turn into a therapy session." She grabbed her purse aggressively and looked to the crowd, expecting support. Instead, people avoided eye contact. Even her own friends stayed seated, unsure whether defending her meant aligning themselves with cruelty. Her confidence dissolved when she realized she no longer held the room. She pointed toward my father sharply. "You are humiliating yourself. Think about how people will remember tonight." My father stood slowly, wiped his eyes, and responded with a strength that didn't come from pride, but from clarity. "Vivian, if tonight is remembered for honesty, I'm at peace with that." A few guests clapped softly, not in celebration, but solidarity. Vivian left the room abruptly, heels striking the floor like a metronome of bitterness. After she exited, my father faced everyone again and spoke with humility, not stage presence. "I can't rewrite the past, but I can change what happens from this moment forward." And then, turning to me again, he added, "If you're willing." I didn't answer right away. Healing isn't a switch. It's a door that must be opened slowly, with caution, boundaries, and honesty. I placed my phone back in my purse, not because he asked me to, but because I wanted to. I had been carrying that recording like a life jacket, but at that moment it no longer felt like I was drowning. "I'm willing to try," I said, "but not rush, not pretend, and not perform." He nodded immediately, accepting terms he didn't even need explained. We both knew what pretending looked like, and we were done with it. My siblings approached afterward quietly. Lauren hugged me first, tears falling down her cheeks as she whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't say anything. I knew it wasn't right, but I was afraid of causing conflict." I didn't blame her. Fear and silence are siblings. I understood both intimately. I hugged her back and said, "We can do better from here." Evan shook my hand awkwardly but sincerely and said, "I didn't realize how bad it was. I should have paid more attention." I nodded. That acknowledgement alone was progress. As people began leaving, many stopped to briefly touch my shoulder, offer warm words, or thank Caleb for being brave enough to speak when adults didn't. He didn't act proud or triumphant. He simply said, "Everyone deserves to feel like they belong somewhere." When we finally made it back to our car, Caleb climbed into his booster seat and buckled himself in with a thoughtful expression. Halfway down the road, he looked at me and asked, "Mom, are you happy?" I gripped the steering wheel for a moment and then answered truthfully, "I'm hopeful, and sometimes hopeful is the beginning of happy." He smiled sleepily, satisfied with that. That night, after putting him to bed, I sat quietly in my living room with a warm blanket over my lap, letting my body unwind. I didn't replay the painful moments. I replayed the moment truth outweighed fear. I realized something powerful. Family is not defined by applause, photographs, or speeches. It is defined by who stands with you when pretending stops. My father and I are not healed yet, but for the first time, we are finally facing the same direction, and that is enough to begin again. So if there's one message I want you to take from my story, it's this. Silence may feel safe, but it never heals. Pretending everything is fine doesn't protect anyone. It only protects the pain that's destroying us from the inside. Sometimes it takes the smallest voice to reveal the biggest truth, and sometimes the bravest person in the room is the one who refuses to accept what everyone else has decided to ignore. I never expected my 8-year-old son to be the one who opened the door to healing, but he reminded me that love isn't about perfection, titles, or speeches. It's about recognition, honesty, and courage. My story isn't about revenge, humiliation, or winning. It's about understanding that change begins when truth gets louder than fear. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or dismissed, I want you to hear me clearly. Your worth is not based on who acknowledges you. Your value existed long before anyone recognized it. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone who needs to hear it, please Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel for more real, powerful stories. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them the most. See you in the next video. And remember, truth is a gift, not a weapon.